I woke up at 3:15 in the morning, not because of a bad dream, not because of pain, but because of a sound that didn't belong to the night, a sound I knew too well, my son's voice, low and careful. The kind of whisper people use when they think no one is listening, and at first I told myself, don't jump to conclusions, sigh, maybe he's worried about something, maybe he can't sleep, maybe he's just talking quietly on the phone. But then I heard my name, not spoken with love, not even with concern, just said like a label, like a file name, and my heart did that strange thing where it didn't race. It slowed down instead. As if my body already understood something my mind was still trying to avoid, and I lay there completely still, not moving a finger, barely breathing, listening through the thin wall that has separated our rooms for years. The same wall that once heard bedtime stories, laughter, and childhood fears, and now it carried words that felt cold and sharp. Take it all out, he whispered, and I remember swallowing slowly, my mouth suddenly dry. Because no son says that about his mother unless he's talking about money, and then came the sentence that settled deep into my bones. She has about 80,000 in there, and I almost laughed, ha ha ha, not because it was funny, but because it was so precise, so confident, so planned, and when he said, she's asleep, she won't know until morning, I felt something strange rise inside me, not panic, not anger, but recognition. That quiet moment when denial finally lets go, and I stared at the ceiling where the faint shadow of an old water stain has kept me company for years, and I thought, so this is who you've become. And then he did the one thing that changed everything. He began saying numbers, slowly, clearly, like he was reading a recipe, my card pin, the same numbers I typed with trembling fingers every month. The same card I used to buy groceries, to pay bills, to live, and each number felt like a small click inside my chest, click, 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 as if a lock was closing, not on my money, but on my heart, and I didn't cry. I didn't even gasp, because somewhere deep down I had been preparing for this moment without knowing it. For months I had felt the distance, the forced smiles, the questions disguised as concern. The way his wife's eyes lingered a little too long when I paid for something, the way conversations always drifted back to planning for the future, and lying there in the dark. I suddenly saw it all line up so clearly it almost felt peaceful, sigh, peaceful in the saddest way, and as he continued whispering instructions, telling her how to withdraw, how to avoid attention, how to make sure nothing looked suspicious, I realized this wasn't an impulse, this wasn't desperation, this was rehearsal. They had practiced this in their minds long before this night, and that's when something unexpected happened, something that still surprises me when I think about it. My lips curved into a small smile, not a happy smile, not a cruel one, but the kind of smile you give when you finally understand the rules of a game you didn't even know you were playing, because in that moment, I understood one painful truth very clearly. I wasn't being betrayed as a mother, I was being targeted as an account balance, and strangely, that clarity took away my fear, because fear needs confusion to survive. And I was no longer confused, I could almost picture them, him pacing softly, her holding the phone close, excitement mixing with nerves, and I felt an ache in my chest, yes, a deep ache. Weeping quietly inside without a single tear falling, because the boy I raised, the one I carried, the one I stayed awake for during fevers and nightmares, was now calculating withdrawals like a stranger. And yet even then, I didn't move, I didn't turn, I didn't make a sound, I kept my breathing slow and steady, because instinct told me that waking up, confronting him, asking why would only give them time to adjust, to lie better, to hide their intentions behind apologies and excuses, and I had lived long enough to know that sometimes the smartest thing you can do is pretend to be asleep while the truth reveals itself. And as his voice faded and the call ended, I heard the soft click of his door, footsteps down the hallway, familiar footsteps that once ran toward me for comfort, now walking past my room without hesitation, and I felt a heaviness settle over me. Not just the weight of betrayal, but the weight of memory, of years of sacrifice, of early mornings and late nights, of choosing saving over comfort, responsibility over ease, all of it now reduced in their minds to something that could be emptied in one night. And still, I smiled in the dark, because while they believed I was sleeping, something else had awakened inside me, something calm, something patient, something that had been shaped by decades of surviving without help. And as I lay there listening to the silence return, I thought, you think tonight is the end of this story, but no, tonight was only the moment I stopped being naive. And as the clock ticked forward second by second, I already knew that by the time the sun rose, nothing would be the same, not for them and certainly not for me. Because sometimes the quietest nights are the ones where the biggest decisions are made, and I had just made mine, and if you think this is where the story peaks, if you think the whisper was the worst part, then you're not ready for what happened next, because the smile I gave in the dark wasn't weakness, it was the beginning of something they never saw coming. By the time the house went completely quiet again, I still hadn't moved, not even an inch, and I stayed that way for a long time, staring into the darkness, replaying his words again and again, not because I enjoyed the pain, Sigh, but because my mind was doing something strange, it was connecting dots I had been ignoring for months, and suddenly moments I once brushed off as nothing began lining up like pieces of a puzzle I never wanted to finish. Because this didn't start that night, no, this started long before the whisper, long before the numbers, long before my card became the center of their attention. It started with small things, harmless things. Or at least that's what I told myself back then, the sudden interest in my bills, the casual questions about how much I kept just in case, the way my son would glance at my purse before sitting down, then look away quickly when he noticed me watching, ha ha ha. I even remember telling myself, you're imagining things, because what kind of mother suspects her own child, right? And yet, lying there in the dark, I could almost hear my younger self whisper back, you just didn't want to admit it, because admitting it meant accepting something far more painful than losing money. It meant accepting that love had turned into calculation, that trust had slowly been replaced by entitlement, and as that thought settled in my chest, I felt a dull ache, not sharp, not explosive, just heavy like grief without tears. Because when you lose someone emotionally before you lose them physically, the morning is quiet and lonely, and my mind drifted back through years of memories, not the bad ones, but the good ones. The mornings I woke before sunrise to get ready for work, hands sore, body tired, but heart full because every hour I worked meant security, meant independence, meant never being a burden to anyone, especially my son. I saved every little extra, skipped vacations, repaired old shoes instead of buying new ones, counted coins at the kitchen table while telling myself, this is love, this is how you protect your child. And I smiled sadly in the dark thinking about how ironic that was, how the very thing I built to protect both of us had now turned into the reason we were breaking apart. And as the night stretched on, I remembered the first time I felt that subtle shift, the first time his wife looked at me not as family, but as opportunity. It was during a simple dinner, nothing dramatic. Just a casual comment about how money sitting still is wasted, said with a smile too polished to be sincere, and I remember nodding politely, brushing it off because arguing would have felt rude. Because keeping peace felt easier than questioning motives, and then there were the visits, the sudden kindness, the gifts I never asked for, coffee I liked, desserts I enjoyed, all delivered with lines like, "We worry about you," or "We just want you to be safe." And lying there now, sigh, I realized how carefully those words had been chosen, how concern had been used as camouflage, and the most painful part wasn't that they wanted my money. It was that they assumed I wouldn't notice, that they believed age had dulled my mind, that being quiet meant being clueless, and I almost laughed again, ha ha ha, because if there's one thing years teach you, it's how to watch without reacting. How to listen without interrupting, how to survive without making noise, and as I lay there replaying everything, I felt something shift inside me, something firm, something steady, because this wasn't just betrayal, it was underestimation. And that lit a small, controlled fire in my chest, not anger, not revenge, but resolve, because I knew one thing for sure now, confronting him tomorrow morning, asking him why, crying, pleading. All of that would only confirm what they already believed, that I was emotional, predictable, easy to handle, and I refused to give them that satisfaction, so instead I stayed silent, I stayed still, I stayed awake, letting the truth settle in layer by layer. And as the clock ticked closer to dawn, I remembered something my own mother once told me when I was young, something I didn't fully understand back then. She said, "The most dangerous person in the room is the one who understands and doesn't react." And lying there, listening to the hum of the house, I finally understood what she meant, because while they believed the night had given them cover, it had given me clarity, and with clarity came calm, a deep, unshakable calm that wrapped around me like armor, and I whispered to myself, barely moving my lips, not yet, because timing matters, because patience isn't weakness. It's strategy, and as the first faint light of morning began to press against the curtains, I closed my eyes for a moment, not to sleep, but to decide, to prepare, to let go of the version of myself who avoided uncomfortable truths. Because from that moment on, I wasn't just a mother anymore, I was a woman protecting her life's work, and if you think realizing the truth was the hardest part, if you think hearing the whisper broke me, then you don't know what it's like to sit quietly and plan while everyone around you believes you're harmless, because the next thing I did, the choice I made after that night, is what truly changed the balance. And they had no idea it was already happening. By the next morning, my body felt tired, but my mind felt strangely clear, like the fog had finally lifted, and as I moved through my usual routine, making tea, rinsing my cup, standing by the window, I kept replaying moments I had once brushed aside with excuses, moments that now felt loud, almost embarrassing in their obviousness, sigh, because how many signs does someone need before they stop pretending everything is fine? And I remembered the first time my son asked, very casually, "Mom, everything okay with the bank?" Said with a tone that tried too hard to sound normal, and I remember laughing it off, ha ha ha, saying something silly like, "Why? Are you planning to rob me?" and the way his smile froze for just half a second before returning, that half second had stayed with me, buried in my memory, waiting for the right moment to surface, and now it was right there. Clear as day. And then there was the afternoon he brought donuts and my favorite coffee without me asking, standing in the kitchen a little too long, eyes drifting toward my desk, my purse, my wallet peeking out like it always did. And back then I told myself, he's just being thoughtful, because it felt better than admitting I felt watched in my own home. And the worst part is how easily we lie to ourselves when the truth threatens the picture we want to keep. Because accepting that your own child might see you as a resource instead of a person feels almost unbearable, and yet the signs kept coming, one after another, subtle but persistent like water dripping on stone. And then there was his wife. Oh, her visits were always wrapped in sweetness, compliments about my house, my cooking, my strength, followed by gentle suggestions about planning, investing, securing the future. Words that sounded helpful but always circled back to control, and I remember sitting across from her, nodding politely, feeling that small knot in my stomach tighten while my mind whispered, something isn't right here, and still. I ignored it because confronting her would have meant confronting him, and confronting him would have meant risking the fragile peace we still had, and I was tired of conflict, tired of tension. Tired of feeling like I had to choose between being respected and being loved, and so I chose silence, thinking it was kindness, thinking it was maturity, thinking it was the right thing to do, but silence, I've learned, doesn't always protect relationships. Sometimes it only protects bad intentions, and as I stood there that morning, holding my cup, staring out at the quiet street, I realized something painful. I had been so focused on not becoming a burden that I had overlooked the fact that I was becoming a target, and that realization made my chest tighten in a way I couldn't ignore, because the pattern was now impossible to deny. The questions, the visits, the sudden interest in my finances, the growing impatience whenever I said no, all of it led to that whisper in the night, and it hurt, not in a dramatic way, not with screaming or tears, but in a slow, sinking way. Like mourning someone who is still alive but no longer who they used to be, and I found myself grieving quietly, grieving the son I raised. The one who used to ask me if we could walk home slowly so the day wouldn't end so fast, the one who once told me I was the safest place in the world. And now here I was, locking parts of myself away just to feel safe under my own roof, and I sighed deeply, because love should never require that, and that's when I understood my biggest mistake. It wasn't saving money, it wasn't trusting too much. It was assuming that love alone could override character, that blood would always be stronger than desire. And standing there in the morning light, I made a quiet promise to myself, a promise I should have made earlier, that I would stop explaining. Stop justifying, stop softening my boundaries to make others comfortable, because the moment someone sees your boundaries as obstacles instead of limits, they've already decided to cross them, and as that thought settled in, I felt a strange mix of sadness and strength, weeping softly inside without tears, because clarity often comes with loss, but it also brings power, and I knew then that the night whisper wasn't the beginning of the story, it was the confirmation. The proof I needed to stop doubting myself, and if you think recognizing the red flags was painful, wait until you hear what I chose to do next, because once you stop ignoring the truth, you can't unsee it, and from that moment on, every step I took was deliberate, every silence intentional, and they still had no idea that their plan had already started to unravel. Once I accepted the truth, something unexpected happened. The fear drained out of me, not all at once, but slowly, like water leaking from a cracked cup, and in its place came something steadier, something colder. And I remember standing there in the kitchen thinking, they think I'm weak, ha, and that almost made me smile again, because weakness doesn't look like silence, weakness looks like panic, and I was no longer panicking, I was thinking carefully. Deeply, the way you do when you've lived long enough to know that rushing only helps the wrong people. And I decided then that I wouldn't confront him, not today, not tomorrow, not with tears or questions or heartbreak spilling everywhere. Because confronting him would turn me into exactly what they expected, emotional, confused, reactive, and I refused to play that role, so instead, I did something that felt strange at first. I let them believe their version of me. The harmless old woman, the mother who trusts too much, the one who sleeps through whispers and plans, because there is power in letting people underestimate you, real power, the kind that doesn't shout or threaten, the kind that waits. And as the day unfolded, I watched my son closely, not obviously, just enough, the way you watch a stranger whose intentions you don't fully trust, and he acted normal, too normal, asking about breakfast, commenting on the weather, laughing at something on his phone, and every laugh felt hollow to me, like a performance, and I realized that while I had been grieving quietly all night, he had already moved on to execution mode, and that confirmed something important. This wasn't about need, it was about entitlement, and entitlement doesn't listen to reason, it only responds to resistance, and resistance doesn't always look loud, sometimes it looks like patience. And so I moved through the day playing my part perfectly. I smiled when expected, nodded when spoken to, even made a small joke at one point, ha ha ha, and the ease with which he relaxed told me everything I needed to know. Because people reveal their true confidence when they think they're in control, and he thought he was, and that thought settled something inside me, because it meant I had time. And time is the one thing you can't steal from someone who knows how to use it. And later that afternoon, as I sat alone in my room, I started planning, not in a dramatic way, not with revenge fantasies or anger, but with logic. Step by step, like solving a problem that had only one acceptable outcome: my safety, my independence, my dignity. And I asked myself hard questions, questions I had avoided for years. What do I need to protect? Who do I need to protect it from? And the hardest one of all, am I willing to accept the consequences? Because protecting yourself sometimes means losing people you never thought you'd have to lose. Awe and that realization hurt more than anything else, but I didn't run from it. I sat with it, letting it sting, letting it sink in, because pretending otherwise would only delay the inevitable, and as I planned. I also reminded myself of who I was before motherhood defined me: a woman who worked, who saved, who learned the value of quiet resilience, who survived loss and loneliness without asking for handouts. And that memory grounded me because I wasn't suddenly becoming someone new. I was returning to someone I had put aside for too long, and I felt a strange pride rise in my chest, mixed with sadness, yes, but also with resolve. And I whispered softly to myself, "You are not helpless." And hearing those words, even just from myself, felt like reclaiming something that had been slipping away, and I knew then that I wouldn't announce my intentions, I wouldn't warn them. I wouldn't give them the chance to adjust their plan, because people who plan in the dark panic when the light comes on, and I intended to control the light. So I waited, watched, listened, learned every small detail. The way my son avoided eye contact when money came up, the way his wife's messages suddenly became sweeter, more frequent, the way concern turned into urgency, and I let them think it was working because the more confident they became, the sloppier they grew, and that's when I understood something that made me exhale deeply, sigh. They weren't as careful as they thought. They were relying on one big assumption that I was unaware, and that assumption was their weakness. And as the evening approached, I felt calm in a way I hadn't felt in months, because while they believed the night would bring them closer to success, it was actually bringing them closer to exposure. And I went to bed that night with a strange sense of control, not knowing every detail of what would happen next, but knowing enough to stay 2 steps ahead. And as I closed my eyes, I didn't feel afraid of the dark, I felt prepared. Because sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is stay quiet and think. And if you're wondering what that thinking led to, what quiet decision I made that changed everything, then you're about to find out. Because the next move I made was the one they never imagined I was capable of making. The next morning I woke up before the sun, not because I was anxious, but because my mind was already moving, calm and focused, like it finally knew where it was going. And as I sat on the edge of my bed, I took a deep breath. Sigh, the kind of breath you take before doing something important, something final, and I remember thinking, this is not revenge, this is protection, because there's a difference. Revenge wants pain, protection wants peace. And I wanted peace more than anything, so I moved quietly through the house, careful not to wake him, the floorboards creaking softly under my feet like they always had, and I almost smiled at how normal everything looked. The same kitchen, the same window, the same chair I had sat in for years, and yet everything felt different, like I was walking through a place I knew but seeing it with new eyes, and I made myself a cup of coffee, strong. Just the way I like it, and I drank it slowly, not rushing, because I wasn't running from anything anymore. I was walking towards something, and when the clock showed it was early enough, I got dressed carefully. Choosing clothes I usually saved for important days, ha ha ha, as if my body already understood that this was one of them, and before leaving, I looked around the house one last time, not with sadness but with intention. And I whispered softly, "I will not be taken from," and those words steadied me more than any prayer ever had, and the walk outside felt strangely light, the air cool, the streets quiet. People starting their days without knowing mine was about to change forever, and as I sat on the bus, watching the city wake up, I didn't feel like a frightened old woman, I felt like someone reclaiming control. And when I reached the bank, the doors had just opened, the familiar smell of paper and air conditioning greeting me like an old friend, and the young woman at the front desk smiled politely, asking how she could help, and I said calmly, "I need to secure my account," and even saying those words out loud made something settle inside me, because naming a problem gives you power over it, and soon I was sitting across from a man who spoke gently, professionally, asking routine questions, and when he asked if there was a reason for the changes, I hesitated for just a moment, then decided the truth deserved air. My family is trying to access my money without my permission. And I watched his expression shift from routine politeness to understanding, the kind that comes from seeing this story too many times, and he nodded, not shocked, not surprised, just ready. And that alone made me feel less alone than I had in weeks, and step by step, we changed everything: the PIN, the alerts, the permissions, every small detail that once felt confusing now felt necessary. And as I chose a new PIN, I smiled quietly to myself, ha ha ha, because it was a date only I would remember, a piece of my own history no one else had ever bothered to learn. And then came the most important decision of all. The one that made my hands tremble just slightly as I said it: I want to move most of my money to a new account. And I remember the man looking at me carefully, then nodding with a kind of respect that made my throat tight. Because he understood exactly what I was doing without me having to explain, and when the numbers changed on the screen, when most of what I had saved moved somewhere unseen, somewhere untouched, I felt a release I didn't know I had been holding in my body, like unclenching a fist I'd kept tight for years. And for a moment, I just sat there, breathing, weeping softly inside without tears, because that money wasn't just money. It was my time, my strength, my youth, all of it now finally protected, and when everything was done, when every safeguard was in place, I walked out of that building feeling taller, lighter, steadier. And I treated myself to something small on the way home: a pastry and another coffee, sitting by the window, watching people pass, and I remember thinking how strange it was that such a quiet morning could carry such weight. Because while they were still sleeping, still planning, still believing their whisper had gone unheard, the ground beneath their plan had already disappeared, and when I finally returned home, my son was awake, acting normal, asking casual questions. And I answered just as casually, because nothing alerts someone faster than a change in tone, and inside I felt a calm confidence, the kind that doesn't need to announce itself. Because the most powerful moves are the ones no one notices until it's too late. And as I sat down, phone buzzing softly with a confirmation message I didn't show anyone, I knew something for certain the moment they tried to act. The moment they reached for what they thought was theirs, they would discover that the story had already shifted, and that discovery, oh, that discovery was going to shake everything they believed. Because the quiet morning I had just lived through was not an ending, it was a setup, and the night they thought belonged to them was about to belong to me. By the time afternoon settled in, the house felt heavier, not because anything had changed on the surface, but because I knew something they didn't, and carrying that kind of knowledge is strange. It sits quietly in your chest, steady and warm, while everything around you moves like usual. And I watched my son scroll through his phone, laugh at something, complain about nothing important, and I thought, if you only knew, sigh, and part of me felt sad. Not for what he was about to lose, but for how far he had already fallen without realizing it. And I moved through the day slowly, deliberately, giving myself permission to feel everything without letting it control me. Because there's a difference between emotion and reaction, and I had learned that lesson the hard way. And at one point, sitting alone in the living room, I caught my reflection in the dark screen of the television, older, yes, tired, yes, but not broken, and I almost smiled at myself, ha ha ha, because I finally looked like someone who had lived, not someone waiting to be taken advantage of. And that's when I thought about you, the one listening to this right now. Maybe lying in bed, maybe doing dishes, maybe feeling that quiet ache of being misunderstood by people who should protect you. And I felt the need to pause for just a second, not to interrupt the story, but to widen it. Because if this sounds familiar, if you've ever felt that sting of realizing someone you love sees you as something to use, not someone to respect, then you're not alone. Awe and stories like this, painful as they are, matter. Because they remind us that awareness is not cruelty, boundaries are not selfish, and choosing yourself doesn't mean you stopped loving, it means you stopped bleeding. So if you're here listening, staying with this story, take a moment, breathe. And if you want to hear more real stories like this, stories that don't sugarcoat the truth but also don't strip it of humanity, then stay close, subscribe. Because sometimes hearing someone else survive gives us permission to survive too. And with that thought, I turned my attention back to the house, back to the quiet tension that hummed under every conversation. And as evening approached, I noticed small changes: my son checking his phone more often, his wife's messages coming in faster, longer, more urgent, and I didn't need to read them to know what they said. Impatience always sounds the same. And that impatience told me something important: they were ready to act, and I could feel it in the air, that subtle shift before something breaks. And instead of fear, I felt prepared, because I had already done the hardest part. I had accepted the truth, and acceptance changes how you move, how you listen, how you wait. And I waited that evening with a calm that surprised even me, making a simple dinner, cleaning up slowly, letting my body move through familiar motions like a ritual. And as I washed the dishes, I thought about how many nights I had done this without thinking, how many times I had cleaned up after others without complaint, believing that care would be returned in kind, and that thought made my chest tighten just a little. Because sometimes it takes betrayal to show you how much you've been giving away for free. And when night finally settled in, I went to bed like always, no locked doors, no raised voice, no dramatic gestures, just the same routine because routine disarms suspicion. And as I lay there, listening to the house breathe, I felt something close to peace. Not because everything was okay, but because I knew exactly where I stood, and if you think this was the calm before the storm, you're right, but it wasn't the kind of storm that arrives without warning. This one had been building for a long time. And as I closed my eyes, breathing slow and even, I knew that what was about to happen would reveal everything, not just to them, but to me as well, because the next night wasn't just going to test their plan. It was going to expose their intentions, and once intentions are exposed, there's no going back, no pretending, no excuses left to hide behind, and I waited in the dark, not afraid, not angry, just ready. Because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stay still and let people show you exactly who they are. That night sleep never really came, my body rested but my mind stayed alert, listening to the quiet the way you listen when you know something is about to happen, and I lay there with my eyes closed, breathing slow, steady, pretending. Because pretending had become my shield, and the house felt different after midnight, every small sound louder, every movement sharper, and then I heard it, the soft click of a door opening. So gentle it would have gone unnoticed by anyone truly asleep, and my heart tightened just a little, awe not from fear but from sadness, because I already knew whose footsteps those were. I had known them since they were small. Since they used to run toward my room after a bad dream, and now those same footsteps moved carefully, cautiously, like a stranger's, and I kept my breathing even, counting it silently so I wouldn't react, in, out, in, out. And I felt him stop near my door, pausing, listening, checking, and I wanted to scream, "I'm right here." I wanted to sit up and ask, "How did we get here, Sai?" But I didn't, because questions wouldn't change what he was about to do. And slowly, painfully slowly, the door opened, just enough, and the faint light from the hallway crept into my room, and I felt him enter, step by step, careful not to make the floorboards creak. And my chest ached so deeply it almost broke my control, because this wasn't just theft, this was intimacy turned inside out, trust reversed, and I lay there like a statue, my body still, my face calm, pretending to sleep while my heart was screaming, and he stood beside my bed for a moment, watching me, and that moment felt endless, because part of me wondered if he would stop, if something in him would wake up and say this is wrong. All but nothing did, and instead I felt the slight shift of my purse being lifted, the zipper opening slowly, the familiar sound of leather moving, and I swallowed hard, forcing myself not to react, not to flinch. Because reacting would have turned the quiet betrayal into a confrontation, and I wasn't ready to give him that. And as his fingers searched through my wallet, I felt tears sting behind my closed eyes, not falling, just burning. Because no mother imagines her child's hands doing this, and yet here they were, moving with confidence, with purpose. And when he finally found the card, I almost laughed inside, ha ha ha, not because it was funny, but because it was so cruelly predictable, and I imagined him copying the numbers, feeling triumphant, believing he was close to victory. And that thought filled me with a strange mix of sorrow and resolve, because even now, even in that moment, he believed I was powerless, and that belief was his biggest mistake. And after what felt like an eternity, the wallet was placed back, the purse closed, the footsteps retreated, and the door closed softly behind him. And only then did I open my eyes, staring into the darkness, a single tear sliding down my temple, not for the money, not even for the act itself, but for the final confirmation that the boy I raised no longer existed. Sigh, because once someone can look at you while you sleep and still choose to take from you, something has already been lost beyond repair, and I stayed there, unmoving, listening as he left the house, the sound of the door, the distant engine starting, and when silence returned, it felt heavier than before, but also clearer, because now there was no doubt left, no room for excuses, no space for hope, and as I lay there staring at the ceiling, I whispered softly to myself, this is the moment everything changes, because what he didn't know, what neither of them knew, was that what he had just taken would lead them nowhere, and the morning that followed. Oh, the morning that followed was going to hit them harder than any confrontation ever could, because sometimes the most painful lesson isn't being caught, it's failing after you were so sure you would succeed. And that failure was already waiting for them. Morning came slowly, the kind of slow that stretches every minute, and I didn't sleep at all after he left. I just lay there listening to the quiet, feeling the weight of what had happened settle deep inside my chest. Sigh, not sharp, not dramatic, just heavy, like a truth finally choosing to stay. And when the first light slipped through the curtains, I got up calmly, almost gently, as if nothing unusual had happened, because outward calm was now my armor. And I made myself tea, not coffee. Tea felt softer, kinder, like something you drink after a long cry even when no tears fall. And I sat at the table watching the clock, knowing exactly what time it was, knowing exactly where they were headed, and I remember thinking how strange it was that the world could look so normal on a morning like this. Birds outside, distant traffic, neighbors starting their day, while somewhere nearby, My son and his wife were walking toward a machine they believed would solve everything, and I didn't rush, I didn't pace, I just waited, because waiting feels different when you already know the ending. And then my phone buzzed once, twice. And I didn't pick it up right away, not because I was playing games, but because I needed that pause, that breath, that final moment of control. And when I finally answered, his voice spilled through the phone, frantic, cracked. Nothing like the calm whisper from the night before. "Mom," he said, breathless, "the card doesn't work." And I closed my eyes slowly, not in relief but in recognition, because this was the sound of a plan collapsing, and I asked softly, "What do you mean it doesn't work?" Even though I knew exactly what he meant, and he started talking fast, words tripping over each other, saying the machine said the account didn't exist, that something must be wrong. That Claire was standing there, people behind her, staring, sigh, and I could hear the panic rising, thick and ugly. And for a moment, just a moment, I felt something twist inside me, a mother's instinct, the urge to soothe, to fix, to make it better. But that instinct passed, because this wasn't a scraped knee, this was a choice, and choices have consequences, and I said calmly, "Did you try again?" And there was silence on the line. The kind that tells you someone is realizing something they don't want to accept, and then he whispered, almost to himself, "She says it's closed," and I let the silence stretch, because silence can say what words can't. And then he asked the question I knew was coming, his voice suddenly smaller, "Mom, what did you do?" And I took a deep breath, steady, slow, and said, "I protected myself," and there it was, the truth spoken out loud, simple, clean. Undeniable, and I could almost hear the pieces falling into place on his end, the late mail, the quiet days, the calm I hadn't explained, and his voice changed, turning sharp, accusing, desperate. "You knew," he said, not asking, stating. And I answered honestly, yes, I knew, and for a second I heard nothing but breathing, his, maybe hers, in the background, and then the anger came rushing in, loud, messy, full of blame, telling me I'd ruined everything. That they were about to lose their house, that this wasn't the time for lessons, and I listened, really listened, because this was the sound of entitlement breaking, and when he finally paused, waiting for me to respond, I said the hardest thing I'd ever had to say to my own child, "You chose this," and my voice didn't shake, not because I didn't care, but because I cared enough to stop lying, and he tried again, pleading now, bargaining, promising things I'd heard before, promises that always arrived too late, and I felt tears sting my eyes, because saying no to your child hurts even when it's right. But I said it anyway, quietly, firmly, "No." And that one word felt heavier than all the others combined, and then he said something that confirmed everything, something that made my chest ache even now. "You should have trusted me," and I almost laughed, ha ha ha, a sad, hollow laugh. Because trust doesn't survive whispers and stolen cards, and I replied, "I trusted you until you gave me a reason not to." And after that there was nothing left to say. The line went quiet, and I set the phone down gently. My hands shaking just a little, not from fear, but from release, because the moment had passed, the secret was out, and the power had shifted completely. And as I sat there, tea cooling in my cup, I knew this wasn't the end, no, not yet. Because the collapse of a plan doesn't always end quietly. Sometimes it brings confrontation, sometimes it brings anger to your doorstep. And as I looked toward the front door, I understood one thing with absolute certainty. The real test was still coming, and it would arrive face to face. They arrived faster than I expected, the sound of the car pulling up sharp and angry, tires biting into the road like they had something to prove, and I stood up slowly from my chair, not rushing, not bracing myself, just standing. Because fear had already left me, and when the door burst open, the air in the room changed instantly. Thick with fury, accusation, desperation, my son stormed in first, his face red, eyes wild. Not looking at me like a mother anymore, but like an obstacle, and his wife followed close behind, shaking, crying, not from guilt but from panic, from things falling apart, and he didn't even let the door close before shouting, "Where is it?" as if the money were a stolen object I had hidden, and I looked at him calmly, really looked at him, and for the first time I felt something close to distance, sigh, the kind that lets you see clearly without the blur of love. And I said softly, "It's safe," and that single word set him off, because calm is unbearable to someone who expects chaos, and he stepped closer, voice rising, blaming me for everything, the debts, the pressure, the mistakes. As if my refusal to be robbed had caused his downfall, and I listened without interrupting, because this wasn't a conversation, it was a confession, and when he finally stopped, breathing hard, waiting for me to collapse or apologize, I didn't. And that confused him more than any argument ever could, and his wife stepped forward then, tears streaming, voice trembling, telling me how desperate they were, how close they were to losing everything, and for a moment I felt that familiar pull, that old instinct to rescue, to soften, to save, but I caught it, held it, and let it pass, because rescuing them now would only teach them that cruelty works if you apply enough pressure, and I said quietly, "I'm sorry you're struggling, but you created this." And the room went silent, not peaceful but stunned, because people don't expect accountability when they're used to blame working, and my son laughed bitterly, saying things meant to hurt. calling me selfish, cold, heartless, and each word landed, yes, but they didn't break me, because I finally understood something important. His anger wasn't about money, it was about control. And control feels like love until it's denied. And when he threatened me then, talking about lawyers, about proving I wasn't well, about taking everything anyway, I felt a strange calm wash over me, ha ha ha. Because threats lose their power when you've already prepared for them, and I told him evenly, I've already spoken to a lawyer, I've already been evaluated, and I've documented everything, and the look on his face, oh, that look. It wasn't rage anymore, it was shock, because for the first time, he realized he wasn't dealing with someone clueless. He was dealing with someone who had been quietly protecting herself, and his wife stared at him. Realization dawning that the ground beneath them was gone, and that's when he said the thing meant to cut deepest, the thing children say when they know they've lost, when you're old and alone, don't come to me, and that hurt. It hurt more than anything else he'd said, because it touched the one fear every parent carries, but I didn't cry, I didn't beg, I just answered honestly. I would rather be alone than live afraid in my own home, and something broke then. Not loudly but completely, and he turned away, grabbing his wife's arm, muttering that this wasn't over, that they'd find another way, but his voice lacked conviction now. And as they walked out, slamming the door behind them, the house fell silent. Not the heavy silence of before, but a new one, empty, echoing, and I stood there for a long moment, breathing, feeling the aftershock ripple through me, and then I sat down slowly and let the tears come, not loud, not dramatic. Just quiet weeping, because while I had won my freedom, I had lost my son, and that is a loss no victory fully replaces. And yet, beneath the grief, there was something else, something steady and real, dignity, untouched, intact, and I knew. Deep down that no matter what happened next, I had chosen the only path that allowed me to live without shame, and if you think that was the end of it, if you think walking out meant the story was finished, then wait. Because the final chapter didn't arrive with shouting or threats, it arrived with something much quieter and much more final. After they left, the house didn't feel broken the way I expected. It felt still, like a lake after a storm finally settles, and I stood there listening to my own breathing, slow and uneven at first, then calmer. Calmer than it had been in years, and I realized something quietly important. Fear had been living here for a long time, not loudly, not obviously, but like a shadow that never fully left the room, and now that shadow was gone. And what replaced it wasn't joy, not yet, but space, room to think, room to exist without watching every word, every movement, every decision, and I moved through the house slowly that day, touching familiar things like I was meeting them again for the first time, the chair by the window, the small table, the curtains I had washed so many times, and everything felt mine again, not shared, not monitored, not calculated. And that feeling brought a quiet ache to my chest, all because ownership of your own life shouldn't feel like a victory, it should feel normal, and yet here I was, treating peace like something newly earned, and as the hours passed, I cleaned without rushing, not to distract myself but to settle myself, each movement grounding me back into my body, back into the present, and when evening came, I made a simple meal, nothing fancy, soup and bread. The kind of dinner you eat when you don't need to impress anyone, and I sat alone at the table, not lonely, just alone, and there's a difference, one hurts, the other heals, and as I ate, memories drifted in, not the painful ones, but small. Ordinary ones, laughter from years ago, mornings that started with hope, and I let them come and go without fighting them, because grief doesn't disappear when you choose yourself, it just changes shape, and later that night, I slept deeply for the first time in weeks, no whispers through walls, no footsteps in the hallway, no tension humming in the dark, just silence, clean and honest, and in that silence, something inside me finally rested. And the days that followed were strange in the gentlest way, quieter, lighter, predictable, and I leaned into that predictability like a gift, waking up early, drinking my coffee slowly, reading the paper, watering the plants. Small routines that reminded me I was still here, still capable, still whole, and when the bank papers arrived safely, untouched, I held them in my hands for a long moment, weeping softly, not because of the numbers, but because of what they represented, years of work, years of restraint, years of choosing long-term safety over short-term comfort, all still mine, protected, respected. And I realized then that money had never been the true center of this story, dignity was, the right to say no without being punished, the right to exist without being used, and a few weeks later, when I passed my son in a grocery store by accident, I didn't stop, and neither did he. Our eyes met for a second, then slid away, and that moment told me everything I needed to know. He hadn't changed. And that was no longer my responsibility, and instead of breaking me, that realization freed me, because love that demands self-destruction isn't love, it's a debt that never stops growing, and I had finally stopped paying it. And as months passed, I built a life that didn't revolve around being needed, but around being at peace, sewing again, walking with friends, laughing over coffee, laughing without guilt, without checking the clock, without wondering who might be watching, and one afternoon, while sitting by the window with sunlight warming my hands, I thought back to that night, to the whisper, to the numbers, to the smile I gave in the dark, and I understood that smile at last. It wasn't satisfaction, it wasn't revenge, it was acceptance, acceptance that I could not control who my son became, but I could control what I allowed, and that control saved me. And if you're listening to this and feeling that familiar heaviness, that quiet pressure to give more than you have, to stay silent to keep the peace, to ignore that small voice telling you something isn't right, please hear this. Sigh, protecting yourself doesn't make you cold, it makes you honest. And honesty is the foundation of any life worth living. And if this story stayed with you, if it made you pause, think, breathe a little differently, then stay here, subscribe, because there are more stories like this. Stories about choosing dignity over guilt, clarity over chaos, peace over pretending. And as the sun set that evening, painting the sky soft orange, I smiled again, the same way I did that night, not because I had won, but because I had finally stopped losing myself. And in that quiet, ordinary moment, I knew something with absolute certainty: my life was mine again, and that was worth everything.